Halito, welcome. All right, when you are going to be seeing this is on Monday the 14th. I will be elsewhere in town, so attending to other particular needs. So I will remind you that this is week 2, therefore there is a reaction paper due on close of business on Wednesday. You can basically react on a one-page format or whatever you want to do, but at least one page on what you've learned so far, the readings, and reaction papers can basically be on the readings, anything on the website, anything that you saw or within the class or thoughts that you've had since then. The following Monday is the Martin Luther King holiday, so we, of course, the college will be closed, will not be meeting, but I encourage you to go to the King celebration. Indeed, on Thursday the 17th, there is a black gay poet, author presenting at the college, I think 1 o'clock to 2:50 on Thursday. If you can all make that, that would be fine. You can write a reaction paper about that as well. And let's get to it. So I'm doing these last 2 slides, which I put up on the website for this, for last week, but I'm going to start here since I didn't verbally go over them. So many of the people in aspiration, when we look at the visual grammar of Aaron Douglas's painting, many of the people, especially in the Harlem Renaissance, but throughout all time, but definitely African Americans in America, we're looking for solutions. We're looking towards adapting white models of socialism and capitalism. Now, the reason that I talk about white models of socialism and capitalism is because many of these social forms and these forms of economy actually came from other places, but took different forms. So, as an example, as I think make as the next point, so many white models of socialism and communism were the only political forms which spoke of racial and gender equality. They aspired towards conditions of equality, or at least they said they did. Now, Marx himself made racist comments about certain black socialists that shared his ideas or had conversations in England and other places in Europe. And we can't totally discount a certain white supremacy within his analysis of what he referred to as chattel slavery. And he basically said that it's the primitive accumulation of capital. That is, human beings are the capital and their property. So he didn't necessarily see enslaved Africans as human beings because he's a European. And they're basically under the influence of close to, at that point, 600 years of a form of white supremacy that basically made the concept of white racial superiority a normal way to think. And so he was a product of those particular times. Not all white people thought like that. Marx and other folks certainly did. So white models of socialism were the only political forms that were going to be taught in the schools within the traditional canon, that even when black people went to school, that's all they would learn. So one of the things that they were looking at is that visual grammar that Douglas is talking about in his painting, the multiple reverberating stars symbolizing socialism, the 3 people sitting on the platform above the outraged arms of the slaves. Basically, slavery was part of capitalism, and it was based on American capitalism. So the white socialists and communists were talking about conditions of equality, at least they said they were, and few capitalists were talking about equality. In fact, many capitalists were frequently racist, and this marriage in America that we saw of capitalism with racism, they equated any talk of equality with socialism and race mixing itself with communism. Now, never mind that, not that they thought this way back then, But the reality of what we've discovered in the 20th and late 20th and early 21st century in terms of the genome, the first genome to arrive is African. White people, as a phenotype within the original African gene, showed up 22,000 years ago. 22,000 years is long enough for different phenotypic races to mix. So race mixing had been going on for quite some time, even at the beginning of Western civilization, but people were tripping about it and equated race mixing with communism. So, if you, for example, if this sounds familiar, Obama's a socialist. He's a race-mixed socialist. So you'll see this link frequently made between civil rights and communism and socialism, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. There are a number of people, number of civil rights folk who were, in fact, socialists, and they were socialists because they believed in racial equality, because the capitalists did not. So one can question, the morality of capitalism, and certainly I do, but if you think about us being a quote-unquote Christian nation, Yeshua, who most people know by his Greek name Jesus, gave healing and food away for free. Did that make him a communist or a socialist? Well, within African conceptions of what's called African socialism, Ujamaa, which one of its central beliefs is spirituality, the reason you share the wealth and share what's necessary for life is because people are your spiritual and sometimes literal family. So which of your children would you not feed? So of course you give that which is nurturing to life for free. Of course you do free health care. Of course you give healing and food for free. Is that socialism? Then Jesus was a socialist. Is Obama a socialist for wanting to give free health care to all American citizens? So, Yeshua was also about establishing an egalitarian social order which was different than the Roman Empire's imperialism. He called it the kingdom of heaven. He said that the kingdom of heaven was within you, or within your community, or at hand. You just had to realize it. Literally, this is what the kingdom of heaven, basically in Aramaic, the language he spoke, and in Hebrew, the same preposition within and among is the same word. So the kingdom of heaven is within you and among your people. So the kingdom of heaven, so I'm mentioning Jesus because the link to the modern civil rights movement in certain forms of Christianity with Martin Luther King, which we won't formally study until spring, but there is that content, that construct within the westernized form of Christian religion where there is a clear link to social activism. There is a clear link to social justice, driven by your spirituality. There is a clear, Jesus wasn't about hierarchies. Was not. So, part of the piece of people following, people within Christian faith, within the civil rights movement, basically saying, okay, we just want to be able to do everything that you're doing, have equality. But that was a difficult stretch for many people raised within a certain framework within Christianity. But if you notice the Romans' initial reaction to Yeshua with that idea, they were basically hunting him down to try and kill him for a great deal of his ministry. So you'll find a lot of political, cultural, and spiritual leaders talking about similar things preceding and throughout the Harlem Renaissance, and this is one of the things that Aaron Douglas is capturing within his painting too. It's going along with the times. So when they're talking about a rebirth, which is essentially what a Renaissance is, they're echoing what happened in Europe after the Dark Ages. Now, what happened with Europe in the Dark Ages is the fall of the Roman Empire. That's when the Dark Ages happened. So there was no concept of a united Europe in the Romans' time. I mean, and if you get your historical reality from movies, then you can look to the movie Gladiator to see how the Romans thought about Germans. Germans were skin-wearing savages that didn't know how to fight an organized, civilized, literate army. And so, fighting slaves to the death for entertainment doesn't necessarily make you civilized, but that's where the Romans were at, right? So there was no unified Europe in the Romans' time. The Romans were attempting to unify many of the countries outside of Italy under one Roman Empire, as well as in Africa. They were actually trying to go for global domination, but didn't quite achieve it. So what happened is essentially Yeshua was killed as a revolutionary, and then the Romans basically kind of hijacked his religion and attempted, even though they converted to Christianity, Rome still fell. And with that, the organizing principle putting together Europe fell into the Dark Ages. Now, Europe was in the Dark Ages. Everywhere else on the planet was not dark. There were no Dark Ages here in Turtle Island. There were no Dark Ages in China. There were no Dark Ages in Africa or the Middle East, just in Europe, where the Romans were. How are they going to get out of it? Well, number of people of color, groups of people of color came into Europe. The Moors, the Muslims came into Europe, brought some of the technology of Egypt in terms of mathematics, architecture, medicine. Those of the Judaic faith who came into Europe were also bringing in some of the technologies of Kemet in terms of mathematics and medicine as well. So and people were bringing spices and all this other stuff within Europe. So people were being brought out of the Dark Ages by the intervention of other groups of human beings coming into Europe. And this is often conveniently forgotten. It's as if within the mythology of Western civilization, they pulled themselves up by their own Greek bootstraps or sandal straps. But it was not the case. It wasn't dark everywhere, just dark in Europe. So as they gradually come out and start having this rebirth called the Renaissance, being assisted by other folks, not that they conveniently wrote that out of their history, but that's one of the things that happened. Slavery for us was the Dark Ages. So we were civilized people, enslaved, brought to America. We were literate, multilingual people in Africa, civilized, living in cities, sometimes literate, sometimes advanced technologically. We were spiritual people, not allowed to be spiritual. So, for example, as I said on the first day, 1/3 of the slaves who were sold into slavery by Muslims were themselves Muslims. So 1/3 of the slaves were Muslim, forced to become Christian if they were allowed to have any spirituality at all. So we were a spiritual people, not allowed to be spiritual, and certainly if you were Christian, you were not practicing a form of Christianity that had a white Jesus. If you look at, and I can show you Ethiopian images of Christ that were happening in the 18th and 17th century, is not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Michelangelo's uncle. It's a brown-skinned, short afro man. Now, the oldest book in the world, the Peshitta, as I told some of you about last week, the Bible in Aramaic, the language that Yeshua spoke. The oldest book in the world is in the British Museum in Cairo. So you could call it an Egyptian Bible if you were. It's in Aramaic. So the oldest book in the world is an Egyptian Bible. The country that has practiced Christianity the longest in the world is Ethiopia. You can find churches carved into the rock from the 1st and 2nd century. Okay, so the oldest book in the world, Egyptian Bible, country that's practiced Christianity the longest in the world, Ethiopia. I think I'm pretty safe in saying Christianity is an African religion in origin. So there are African Christians being sold into slavery, and they sure ain't worshiping Michelangelo's uncle or calling him Jesus. They'd probably use Yeshua or Isa or any of a number of the names that are African-style names that he's referred to on that continent. So we were a spiritual people, not allowed to be spiritual. We were a literate people in America, not allowed to read, write, or think. Slavery was the Dark Ages. We were scientific, cultural, and technologically adept people who were only allowed to innovate as long as it profited others, or others would steal or take credit for our innovations. So certainly, since we had also cultivated cotton and there are cotton growing states, it's us that's going to come up with something like a cotton gin. Though maybe that isn't written in history that way. But we were technologically adept. Just let it stand at that. But we weren't allowed to be except as iron workers for Massa or musical entertainment. So, aspiration, looking upward from slavery. Breathing in and looking within. Breathing out and looking upward towards the possibilities. That's the visual grammar of the painting. And aspiring to be the best we can be. So if we aspire to be the best we can be, what is a healthy African American? Now, in ethnic studies, because remember, we're not just doing history. I myself am a therapist, so I have to look at what is a healthy African American. So any discussion of what health means to Africans in America must begin where we, or they, if you will, began. Their healthy roots in pre-colonial Africa. So Africa is a continent where more than 600, well, National Geographic actually says 2,000, so let's say 2,000 languages were or are spoken. The minimum language capability for any child can be up to 5 languages. So you saw your classmates who are of direct African origin, speaking 4 to 7 or 8 languages. Okay? That was the norm and had been the norm. So many Africans living today come here speaking multiple languages. So this was the normal capability of the average slave. So unlike what you might have been taught about slavery in America, the logic chain of America saying slavery improved black people, now obviously a racist lie being taught as truth, but that's not what we would say, and that's not what the evidence indicates. So if 5 languages are spoken, it's possible to be literate in at least 1, but not surprising to be literate in 3. So for example, definitely the Abrahamic religions are people of the book. That is in order of appearance, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So it's possible to be literate in 3 languages. So there's easily also going to be at least 5 types of religions. So the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, a tribal religion like Ifa, Vodun, or animism, or variants combining all of them. So animism basically is saying, just like the Comedian concept I was talking about of neter and neteru, becoming the English word nature, God is within creation. They're inseparable. Every atom is conscious and part of that consciousness. So animism basically is saying that things that we would not necessarily consider conscious or spiritual within a Western framework are within that particular framework, the animist framework. Some tribal groups supported up to 12 kinds of marriage between males, females, and other forms outside of a simple pair bond. So it could be same-sex, it could be group, it could be extended family, you could look at Hershkowitz's book and see what he's talking about within the faun of Dahomey. It's cited in Audre Lorde's book, Sister Outsider. So if all of these would be considered part of the extended family, which is only partially defined by blood ties, and more importantly defined by relationships and kinship. So you could have aunties, uncles, relatives, cousins, etc., some of whom might be biologically related to you, but are all of whom you feel a kinship to regardless of your actual blood ties. So men farmed or hunted, and sometimes women could hunt as well. Women ran the markets. In time of war, armies could be composed of women and men, or women or men, and led by either. So if we're talking about Dahomey, which is now known as Benin, the Amazons were basically part of such a military force as we talked about earlier. And then you'd, of course, evolve a social form and a form of marriage that would naturally fit that particular conception of equality. So here you have Africans in Africa essentially living in a closer state of gender equality and economical equality than they would within an American framework. And so women run markets, so there is a form of exchange going on in, whether you call it capitalism or socialism, but within African socialism, you don't own the land because there is no real estate. You cannot own, you only own what you create. And since humans did not create the land, they can't own the land. That's like owning sunshine or the rain. It's only in capitalism where you have something like Bechtel Corporation saying, well, we own the rainwater in Bolivia, so you peasants have to participate in our water system, and it's going to be illegal for you to catch rainwater off of your roof to drink because you can't afford our water system. If you don't know what I'm talking about a real event. So what happened, for example, if you think Quantum of Solace, the Bond movie, was fiction, no, Bechtel Corporation actually tried to do that in Bolivia. Built a water and power system and basically said, we own the rain, because people couldn't afford to be hooked up to the water and electrical system because they were too poor. So they were catching rainwater off of their roofs. And Bechtel tried to make the Bolivian government send the army around to stop people from catching rainwater because they said the rainwater was their property. So, not to sound racist, but who but white folks would think you can own the rain? Really? An American corporation thinks it owns the rain in Bolivia. This caused the popular uprising that caused that government to be deposed, and the first indigenous person be President Evo Morales. A little story behind the story. So I'm just saying, within indigenous communities, they had a different concept of what capitalism was, or what we would call socialism, okay, where you own things in common. The concept of Iroquois Six Nations, where it's being run by women, and the women select chiefs, and the chiefs basically just are the ones who basically are leaders, but we don't go to war until the chiefs meet in open council 3 times and fail to make a resolution, and only then do we go to war. And at any time, they can be unchiefed by the clan mothers, Iroquois Six Nations. You don't own the land. It's held in common because the land is a living thing, and you don't own living things. You don't own land. So Native Americans didn't believe in real estate. Africans did not believe in real estate. The concept of real estate, king's land, is a European concept, where in that form of feudalism, the king owned you if you were a serf. Serf is equivalent to slave. So, as Marx talked about, feudalism led to capitalism, where kings and queens were replaced by merchants, or capitalists who finance factories or the means of production, and then paid people a living wage and then made a profit. So when Adam Smith talked about in his Wealth of Nations, he was a Methodist minister who basically said the purpose of wealth in God's plan, wealth is God's gift to you to give to those who don't have. The purpose of wealth is good, profit is good, because God's blessing you to give to others. So you have actually a duty to help others less fortunate than you. Okay, that's a moral duty, in fact. So essentially what we're talking about with chattel slavery is amoral capitalism, where the capitalism that we're running in America is came out of slavery, where you own people or you own people's time and you pay them an hourly wage. So where this came from within that particular framework with the relationship to chattel slavery is people were property. And that if you bought a female slave, you had the right to rape her, get her pregnant, and sell her children. That is your child. And not feel anything about it. Because she's not human. She's property. Okay? So the morality of that, well, it was justified. And it's justified by a westernized form of Christianity that said, oh, well, God cursed black people, so they're inferior. It's your Christian duty to civilize them through slavery and exposing them to a Europeanized form of the religion. All right? So part of this is what slaves are coming to in a certain context, and this is what is leading to the, after slavery, the Renaissance. So Africans in Africa are coming from a different context. So being African American means that you are forced by America to speak only one language when you are genetically programmed to speak 5 or more. It means being denied access to literacy by law or on pain of death, but you learn to read and write anyway, knowing the risk. It means fighting for a country that refuses to see you as a human being, even as you fight that country's wars. So black people have fought in every war that America has ever had, even before there was an America. And the conditions that they usually fought under was that they wouldn't be accepted by George Washington or the Revolutionary War folks at first, until the British offered black people the opportunity to fight on their side, paid, and then Washington allowed black people to fight for the independence of the new nation. Same thing with the Civil War, World War I, segregated units, World War II, segregated units, etc. So it means being used to accepting and utilizing human diversity as a fact and a tool that your African culture predisposes you to, seeing human diversity as a fact and a tool, but being forced to live in and accept as normal a whites-only, white supremacist cultural model that says that you should be grateful for being enslaved because slavery improved you from a condition of savagery in Africa. And of course, this is an actual course content being taught at Lane Community College, not in the same department that this one is coming from. So, it always helps to have a counter-narrative. So out of Africa, out of Homo habilis arises Homo sapiens. So 60,000 or 3,000, 60,000 years or 3,000 generations between the development of clothing and the raising of the Sphinx and the pyramids in Africa, which basically Homo habilis was close to 1 million years and Homo sapiens arose about 250,000, 200,000 years ago. So between 60,000 years or 3,000 generations between the development of clothing, Homo habilis, and the raising of the pyramids. So big game hunting with Homo habilis, cooking, storytelling, i.e. history and mythology, a calendar, an alphabet, all this with Homo sapiens, mathematics, metallurgy, music, religion, medicine, agriculture, astronomy. So all these are basically necessary to create a pyramid. And so we're looking at least 60,000 years or 3,000 generations to be able to develop all those things. Okay? Habilas had big game hunting, had language, had clothing, obviously could cook food and had fire, storytelling, and from that, Homo sapiens arises and all the other stuff gets added on, and you got about 60,000 years before we have the raising the pyramids. So now those are all those things that are starred are the things that you need to actually raise the pyramids, because of how the technology of what it takes to make pyramids. Because obviously I don't believe in space aliens, so saying that we did this is what it would require. So one could see that Africans have occupied a number of roles on the world stage. Anything that they do in America should not come as a surprise. They should also not simply accept whatever possibilities America offers as the end-all, be-all. So America is at best an adolescent culture. So what I mean by that, let's say, the reason I made that point about 60,000 years, let's say that 100 years of human civilization equals 1 year of life. And let me be charitable and say that Western civilization is 1,000 years old. And that's being charitable. That makes Western civilization essentially a 10-year-old. And America, a 2-year-old. Two-year-olds with nukes and cell phones, but not civilized exactly. So America is at best an adolescent culture in that sense, in terms of being around and being continuously innovative, even though we think we're pretty hot. But we still have people who are starving, people who are without health care. Still have racism as a driving force. So, adolescence is itself a social construct, created in part as a form of oppression. There's certain views that look at it like that. Like slavery, adolescence is created through a structured lack of education that is culturally reinforced. So what I mean by adolescence as a social construct, all right? In cultures of tradition that are older than 1,000 years, they have things like rites of passage, where a child is given specific instructions so that before the onset of puberty, civic instructions, education, and training, trials, and tests of skill and intellect, so that they are able to take on adult responsibilities by the time they have the onset of puberty. So there is no adolescence in cultures of tradition, because they basically say, okay, if you're ready to, create children, you're functionally an adult, and so we'll send you on these rites of passage. So pre-contact Aboriginal people had walkabout, where a male child would basically go out into the bush for a year and be isolated, live alone, and come back, and if you weren't eaten or died, you became a functional adult. Africans, like the Maasai, basically, if you're a male child, you go kill a lion with a spear. You don't survive the lion, well, your genes don't, get spread in the culture. So, tests of skill, and women had also their own rites of passage. So, in all those cultures where they have rites of passage, you don't have adolescence. You don't have this long period of searching. In America, adolescence is defined as the onset of puberty till when exactly? I know you're not here, but basically what people will say, well, what are your rites of passage? What? First time you use drugs, first time you have sex, your driver's license, 18, you have to register if you're male, so voting. And then 21, you can drink legally. Those are your rites of passage. So you see what could be the problem here. America is not old enough to be called a mature civilization. And if Western civilization destroyed in the process of becoming Western civilization, the indigenous European civilizations that did have rites of passage and were wiped out either by Roman conquest or during the Dark Ages or inquisitions or the witch burnings that happened during the Dark Ages as a result of the European church, then what do you have? You have these artificial signs of adulthood where you don't have those things in other cultures. Of course, in other cultures, you don't have the technological advances, but our toys do not make us wiser. Cell phones did not make us wiser. So part of the piece here then is like when I say being charitable, Western civilization is essentially a 10-year-old and America is a 2-year-old. What do 2-year-olds do? Those of you who are parents. No. Mine. Not mature. When we were talking about last class about W. Bush basically making that stupid mistake about calling the military operation after 9/11 Operation Infinite Justice. That was ahistorical and stupid. You have to calculate, if you're the President of the United States, the impact of your words on the world stage. You can't act as if you don't care. You can't do that. So, slavery, adolescence is created through a structured lack of education that is culturally reinforced. And because it's culturally reinforced, it is presented as normal. So in Douglas's painting in Aspiration, when you saw the globe there, that presumes that you're supposed to know your geography. You're supposed to be able to operate on the world stage, not just be confined in the ghetto, which means you also have to be educated, and that means self-educated. So, in American culture, adolescents don't always do what's best for themselves or others. They don't plan for the future. They act as if there are no consequences for others in the actions they take on their own behalf. American foreign policy basically does that too. Certainly. So, the last time there was a society with as many different world cultures in one place as part of that society, well, is definitely older than 200 years old. And that was Egypt. Dynastic Egypt. And certainly older than 519, which is basically, at the time, all I was willing to concede a pure European civilization, i.e. white civilization was. It wasn't actually true in 1492, but I'm following the traditional canon of the dominant culture mythology, even though I know it's an illusion. The illusion is this. Western civilization, or what we're told Western civilization is, like it's wholly white, like started in Greece and Romans and pulled themselves up by their civilized bootstraps. the Greeks and Romans themselves were multiracial societies, and the Greeks in particular said they learned civilization at the hands of black Africans. That's what their own historians, for example, Herodotus, say. So, if we're talking about Western civilization being wholly white, well, you can't start in Greece. So if you started in Europe, well, even those societies weren't also wholly European or white either. They were all multiracial as well. But you get that in an African American class, not necessarily in the Western canon. So when we get to the point of when Isho talks about what you've done to the least of these, when we get to the point where the quote-unquote least of these can be president without it being either a novelty or worthy of comment, lead troops into battle, and the battle is to eliminate disease, poverty, ignorance, discrimination rather than other living beings, will actually be civilized. So if I were going to use an extreme example, and people have called me crazy for saying this, if you can have a black, lesbian, Muslim woman elected to president or lead combat troops into battle, and the battle is actually a war on poverty, not a war on poor people, but building up the country so that everybody has food, clothing, and shelter, and an education to make their dreams happen, and that's the function of your army, to eliminate ignorance, disease, and poverty, not kill people, then you're civilized. But we ain't civilized. We're 2-year-olds with nukes and cell phones. So we'll have arrived as a mature civilization. But right at the moment, we're 2-year-olds. Since Africans were in America before Europeans were, perhaps it's up to us to suggest a more mature way. So I have an agenda, and this is kind of a Sankofa bird walk, but the establishment of an Atlantean democracy. Now, I'm not talking about the lost continent of Atlantis. And we haven't talked about necessarily the origins of the word democracy, but it was a Comedian word. The Demotic script, if you remember, the 26 characters out of hieroglyphics, which were taught to the common people. Demotic, demo means the people in Comedian. It got translated into Greek because 80% of the Greek language is either Phoenician or Comedian. 80% by conquest. Basically, that's how the cultural transfer happened by conquest. This is according to Bernal in his book Black Athena. He talks about that. He's a linguist, Jewish linguist, that talks about the Aryan model of Western civilization or the ancient model. The Aryan model developed in Germany, which basically said that white civilization pulled itself up by its bootstraps without any help from people of color. It originated in Germany, and that's one of the origins, the philosophical and other origins of white supremacy. Versus the Aryan model versus the ancient model. And the ancient model is the model that the Greeks themselves had, where they learned civilization from black Africans, and they say that. So, Atlantean democracy. So, national security in an Atlantean democracy. So, last term in the class we learned of one of the African titles for this continent, Atlanta, which means water and metal. So Herodotus and others talk about the learning from the Egyptians of a land west of the Pillars of Hercules, that is near past the Rock of Gibraltar, where Europe and Africa are separated by the Mediterranean Sea, and west of the Pillars of Hercules is the fabled quote-unquote island of Atlantis. Well, Atlantis was an island, it was a continent. And in Egypt, they referred to that continent as either Atalanta, water, metal, because there was a trading relationship with them, or the circuit of the world, which means it's the only continent that stretches from the North Pole to the South Pole unbroken. And the inhabitants of that continent call it Turtle Island or Tulipit Wapakissanet, the long-reaching land, North, Central, and South America. So yes, I'm saying Atlantis is actually America. It's not lost. So, the Comedian name for Turtle Island, Atalanta. So, Atlantean Democracy is a paper I wrote, published on the Obama website in community blogs, but I'll put it on your Moodle website if you like. So, Atlantean Democracy, here's the concept. National security. Every human being sheltered, clothed, fed, educated to be able to exercise their vote or voice and maintain their health. Citizenship based on the willingness to participate and increase the common good, particularly national security. And again, national security means every human being sheltered, clothed, fed, educated, able to exercise their vote and voice and maintain their health. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, etc., if you will. Citizenship based on the willingness to participate and increase the common good, particularly national security. So before 1492, not only was there not racism or sexism on this continent, but we didn't believe in illegal aliens. Okay, when the student in the back, since he's not here, I can't put a face to his name, therefore his name, but he talked about, it's a brother from Morocco, basically talked about there were no borders in Africa. Right. There's no borders. There were no borders here. There is no concept of a border. You don't have a border because you don't own the land. You can traditionally occupy the land, and people are coming into your living room and acting as if they're coming into your living room and being respectful. But they're not illegal aliens. They're not even aliens. They're just relatives you haven't met yet. So when we're talking about national security, there ain't no illegal aliens, and everybody who's showing up willing to compete, to not compete, to contribute to the common good is a citizen. That's a different construct than we have here in America. So, an Atlantean democracy is one in which every sentient human being attaining their culturally appropriate age of majority has a voice in the government without any restriction. So, for example, the current South African Constitution